Hi, guys. Oh, my God, it's Ugly Bob! What the hell are you doing here?
Coming in at number 5 is The Legend of Zelda. This is definitely the toughest entry on the list to justify. For all that the original Zelda was responsible for in the world of video games, it still has elements that feel oddly limiting to this day, biggest of which is Link's inability to move or attack in more than 4 directions. This made sense in a game like Star Tropics, in which the entire game was designed with that in mind, but it makes Zelda's design feel lazy today, leaving the dungeon crawling tedious. Add in the inability to tell when walls can be bombed and the fact that arrows cost money, and you have some curious design decisions that were thankfully done away with in later games in the series. This might be nitpicking, I admit that, but there it is. The combat in Zelda is unimaginative too, with the knowledge that throwing your sword was meant as a crutch to rely on rather than having to fight strategically. Just spam the energy bolts over and over again. Does a wooden sword having such power even make sense? Number 4 is Final Fight on the SNES. Picture this, it's 1991, the Super Nintendo is about to launch. Capcom, one of the greatest third-party developers ever, is on board to make games for the system. What better choice than their arcade classic, Final Fight, the game that really put the beat-em-up genre on a pedestal. Forget Double Dragon, this was the first really good one in my opinion. I remember playing this game at a short-lived store called Captron. I remember it didn't last long because they had like 6 TVs set up with the latest games from Tecmo Wrestling to Super Mario World. Why buy a game when you can play it for free all day? Which many people did. Anyway, I remember seeing Final Fight there and was amazed at the great graphics, fluid animation, and it's being great fun. I mean, I didn't go to the arcade a lot, but I was like, wow, the Super Nintendo, this looks like arcade quality, unlike the NES where you could tell the difference really easily. The funny thing is, it turns out it was a very poor port, with no 2-player option, missing levels and bosses, censored enemies, slowdown, and no more than 3 enemies on screen at once. That's probably the most noticeable thing, because it's something that maintained through the rest of the series for unknown reasons, whereas the arcade version can have like 6 to 8 enemies on screen at any one time, which happens quite often. It really seems limiting when you can only have 3 on the Super Nintendo version. And overall, compared to the arcade version, this is just trash. What happened, Capcom? Super Ghouls and Ghost and UN Squadron on the SNES turned out great, better than the arcade in some ways. So what is the deal? Number 3 is Streets of Rage 3 on the Genesis. When I first played this game in 1995, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It just wasn't Streets of Rage. The music really blows when compared to the second game, the story makes no sense, and the game is too hard. I found out later that the developers fucked up, making the Japanese hard difficulty our default difficulty setting, and it's very noticeable with enemies doing a lot of damage to you, cheap situations, and other similar things. What I found out later was that Sega edited the game for some controversy over homosexuality and the overt nuclear storyline. I was flabbergasted. This coming from Sega, the company that claimed it was the cool company in video games, that Sonic's attitude was way better than Mario, and so on. For them to censor these potentially minor objections was a really low move. Where's the attitude now, Sega? Number 2 is Final Fantasy II on SNES. Let's leave aside all the localization bull for a minute and think on what we have here. A bastardized version of one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. Cecil's Dark Wave is gone along with many other cool unique abilities. The story is censored, often in very questionable ways. How is getting crushed by a giant fucking steel ball more acceptable than being sliced in half by a giant scythe? Tons of items are removed, leaving us with no attack items or individual stat heals like eye drops or echo herbs. Instead, we get the heal item, others that you can buy right away, and tons more. Probably the most significant removal is the alarm item, which is great for treasure hunting because it forces rare encounters. Good luck getting the glass helmet or adamant armor without it. This was the second Final Fantasy, alright, the second fiddle to the masterpiece known as Final Fantasy IV. I can see why this game goes for so much on eBay. Nobody wants it anymore but collectors. Coming in at number 1 is TMNT 2, the arcade game on the NES. I remember being really excited for the home release of this classic arcade game. No more having to pay $10 just to complete it in the arcade. This plus a free Pizza Hut coupon, what's not to love? Turns out a lot, actually. The game on the NES was strangely repetitive. Maybe it was the meh graphics that are still excellent for the NES. The music, not so great. I don't know, but it just doesn't hold up. The biggest reason probably is that every character plays the same, with the same abusable jump kick over and over again, and this gets boring really quickly. You must remember that this wasn't the case in the arcade version, with each turtle playing subtly different from each other. People who knew the game well knew that there were definitely differences between the turtles. There are also a lot fewer attacks in the NES version, and the variety of the gameplay is gone. The most annoying thing is the stupid invincibility when you hit an enemy, causing them to fly back, and this prevents you from hitting them again and beating them easily. It's so frustrating. Even the much maligned first TMNT game had each turtle play differently from each other. The vaunted extra levels were long and tedious, with cheap enemies and annoying obstacles. Anybody remember Vincent Van Tiger? Can anybody figure out how to beat him? I loved this game when I was younger, mostly because it was the only way to play the game, but nowadays the NES version just sucks.